we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for the Thursday night live stream from Budapest. So welcome everybody who has joined me, and there's quite a lot to get to, but there's enormous cause for rejoicing and celebration in Europe because, yes, the EU has met in Cyprus with Vladimir Zelensky and has been able to hand over to him the at least a promise of imminent delivery of the 90 billion euros, that Ukraine was promised last December, but it was held up on account of this terrible Viktor Orban in Hungary. But now that there's a new government, well, there isn't a new government yet, but a new government will be in place sometime next month. And Viktor Orban is on the way out. He didn't even attend the meeting today in Cyprus. Then nothing stands in the way of this 90 billion euro loan. Now, the use of the word loan is, of course, a complete misnomer, but nonetheless, it's something that all these the various European creatures and, of course, the media mouthpieces, they will talk about this loan to Ukraine. And that you have to keep in mind, everybody knows that Ukraine has not the slightest intention of repaying any of this money. I mean, it doesn't have any money. I mean, how's it going to repay the money? I mean, when you give somebody, a deadbeat money, that the deadbeat isn't going to pay you back. So, it's totally a misnomer to call it a loan. But that's how the way the European governments, and of course the EU, sells this piece of deceit to the European public, that a loan has been extended to Ukraine, and that this horrible, terrible Viktor Orban is now no longer in any position to thwart the award of this loan. Now, the vague premise underlying this loan is that, well, we all know Ukraine is not going to pay this money back. So what will happen is that we, the creditors, the Europeans, the creditors, and that means the European taxpayers, we will be able to get this money out of the frozen assets that we've basically been holding on to of Russia since 2022. So somehow this loan will actually be repaid to us, the Europeans, because we're just going to get our hands on these sovereign assets. Now, the issue of the sovereign assets. Of course, we've talked about this many times before, and it's already been made clear that the Bart de Wever, or Belgium at the very least, is going to raise objections about handing over any of this frozen assets, because obviously, if you just simply steal money that has been invested, then you're just engaging in outright thievery, and you're seen to be engaging in outright thievery, and therefore you will lose your reputation as any kind of a banker. I mean, now who's going to deposit money with you if there's any danger that you're just going to seize the money that has been deposited? This was the point made by Bart de Wever last December. Now, the EU didn't really think much of that, and are probably hoping that they'll see the back of Bart de Wever, much as they've now seen the back of Viktor Orban. Now, going back to this loan, what had happened was, if you recall, Vladimir Zelensky had claimed that the Druzhba pipeline, the pipeline that delivers oil from Russia to Hungary and Slovakia, this Druzhba pipeline cannot be repaired. It's been damaged. It was damaged by Russia, and Ukraine is unable to repair it. It's very now the claim that it was damaged by Russia is, of course, just Ukraine's claim, and of course, even the media have reported, um, reasonably regularly that Ukraine has been targeting the Druzhba pipeline again and again. Ukraine has targeted the Druzhba pipeline, and so the claim that somehow, it was damaged by Russia and Ukraine is doing its best to repair the pipeline because it's so desperate to ensure that Hungary and Slovakia, the two EU states that are the most skeptical about Ukraine's membership, or Ukraine's putative membership of the EU, it's just, we just can't deliver. I'm sorry, but we're not able to deliver this oil. Now, obviously, that the Ukraine's refusal, and that's what it was, a refusal to allow oil from Russia to reach Hungary and Slovakia, particularly Hungary, was a maneuver to ensure the defeat of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Because essentially, he was there in order to, he sabotaged the pipeline, much as Ukraine, at least according to official stories emanating from Germany, much as Ukraine sabotaged the Nord Stream gas pipelines in order to ensure that Russia did not earn any money on its oil and gas exports. So Ukraine had every incentive to make sure that Hungary did not receive oil from Russia, oil that it had paid for, and therefore, that would weaken Viktor Orban politically, because one of his selling points, one of his most explicit campaign promises is that we, Fidesz, will make energy affordable for Hungarians. So everyone else in Europe is paying through the nose for their energy, but here in Hungary, we pay little because we continue to get our oil and gas from Russia. We haven't cut ourselves off from Russia, unlike other Europeans who rushed ahead with their sanctions against Russia. We continue to get our oil and gas from Russia. We get our oil through the Druzhba pipeline, and we get our gas through South Stream. Instead, the Ukraine has continually targeted the South Stream gas pipeline. Also, that's mentioned in the media. Often, it just gets ignored. Politico doesn't write about it. Guardian doesn't write about it. But yeah, I mean, Ukraine has targeted regularly the Druzhba oil pipeline and, of course, the South Stream gas pipeline. So when Zelensky, in order to affect the Hungarian election, claimed that Ukraine is just not able to repair the oil pipeline, just not able to do it. This was obviously, to ensure Russia was not getting oil, and that it had the effect on the election. And the EU, while the EU expressed some sympathy for Hungary and indeed offered to send a a team of inspectors to Ukraine to see whether the Druzhba pipeline could be repaired. Didn't really do much to press its case. And so when Zelensky said, nah, we really don't want a team of EU inspectors coming to look at the pipeline, just we don't need it. The EU said, okay, well, then we won't send anyone. And of course, once the election was over and Viktor Orban was defeated, then suddenly, miraculously, Ukraine was able to repair the Druzhba pipeline. And once the oil started flowing to Hungary and to Slovakia, Hungary and Slovakia withdrew their objection to the 90 billion euro loan, and even more to the great delight of the EU worthies, Hungary and Slovakia withdrew their objection to the 20th round of sanctions. With these 20th round of sanctions, 19th round of sanctions didn't get the job done, but the 20th is bound to do so. So this was then a moment of celebration today in Cyprus at this meeting of the EU. Finally, this is wonderful news. We've given this 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine. 20th round of sanctions agreed upon. Viktor Orban defeated in Hungary. Orban didn't even show up for this meeting. And even more wonderfully, they're moving ahead to fast track Ukraine's membership in the EU. Now, what's interesting about these events is that, of course, once Ukraine has this money, then there's absolutely nothing to stop Ukraine once again to target the Druzhba pipeline and the South Stream gas pipeline. Of course, it's because everything that Ukraine is doing is with a view to ensuring that Russia doesn't earn any money by exporting energy to Europe. That's what it's trying to do. That's why it's been hitting the pipelines on a regular basis. They want to stop all energy deliveries from Russia to Europe. So of course they're going to do it once they've got this money. Once Hungary and Slovakia have withdrawn their objection to the 90 billion euro loan, once they've withdrawn their objection to the sanctions package, then of course Zelensky is going to do this right away. And this was actually admitted to by Robert Fico, the Slovak prime minister. Said, "Well, I think maybe he's going to do this again." Well, of course he's going to do this again. I mean, why wouldn't he? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that 90 billion euros, that's a lot of money. And that's money is just going to disappear very quickly. So by the time we're celebrating the release of this 90 billion euros, Ukraine is already presenting its bill for the next tranche of money. Now, as we've discussed here on many occasions, Hungary, little Hungary, which is a member of the EU, which is a member of NATO, Hungary has been denied some 30 billion euros. It's always very little difficult to know what these exact numbers are, but that's 30 billion euros that it's entitled to. The EU has denied it, and the EU has repeatedly come up with all sorts of reasons why Hungary can't get this 30 billion euros. Well, we're not happy with the condition of academic freedom in Hungary. In other words, Hungary needs to appoint professors that we in the EU tell it to appoint. The usual kind of Soros type professors. Um, so, and then we're not happy with the judicial independence in Hungary. You know, this is from states that regularly practice lawfare. So we're not happy about judicial independence, as opposed to the judicial independence you get in France, where the French judges just simply rule that Marine Le Pen cannot run for president in 2027, where the French judges that declare that Pavel Durov and the Telegram channel are committing some kind of a crime unless they play ball with the French state. So, but nonetheless, it's another one of the reasons. And of course, as we discussed on Tuesday, there's the whole LGBTQ stuff. Another reason why Hungary can't get its hands on the money. So here's 30 billion euros. Hungary's not getting a sniff of that. Unless, and of course, there's the immigrant issue. Somebody says here very, very nicely, and put it, Michael Ignatieff was Soros' favorite before Orban ousted him. Yes, indeed. Michael Ignatieff, people will remember him. It was one of these, he was a kind of a pseudo-intellectual who became famous in Great Britain during the 1980s as the sort of the go-to intellectual, always purported to be an expert on everything, talk about philosophy and ideas, existentialism and whatnot. Anyway, he would have all these television shows in the UK discussing men and ideas. Then he became this is let Dasein live. He became a Soros man, and he was appointed the head of the Central European University. And as we've discussed many times before, although the media, the kind of obsequious, dim-witted media, repeatedly refer to the Central European University as a world-renowned academic center, it's famous for its rigorous standards and its and intellectual excellence, which is, of course, it was nothing of the sort. It was always a politicized institution, with the project, the Soros project of creating a political cadre that would take over in Hungary. That's what Soros wanted. That's why he created the Central European University, and he installed Michael Ignatieff as its head. And of course, as I've explained before, what made the Central European University a kind of a magnet for young Hungarians had nothing to do with its reputation for academic excellence, but because it offered degrees at an accredited American university. So you got with the Central European University, you got a degree at an accredited Hungarian university and at an accredited American university. And of course, the Hungarian government, after a while, said, "Well, we're getting a little tired of this. Show us that you are an accredited academic university. So that prove to us that you are an accredited academic university. Show us your campus." Well, of course, he didn't have a campus. And then Ignatieff started whining and said, "Well, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources for a campus in America. We just don't have it." Well, if you don't have a campus in the United States, then you're not an accredited American university. And then once it ceased to be an accredited American university, then, of course, students didn't want to go there anymore. I mean, what was the point? I mean, that was the only reason there was a draw for it. And then, of course, part of it left. The part that was the accredited American university part that went to Vienna, and what was left of the Central European University was the accredited Hungarian part. But no one was really interested. I mean, just going there just to get a Hungarian university degree. So anyway, Dasein said his catchphrase was that universities are, quote, counter-majoritarian institution, which was easy to attack, I suppose. Counter-majoritarian. Yeah, that sounds like Ignatieff. Anyway, but these were all reasons that were put forward. I mean, in all the Orban years, there have been wave after wave of campaigns against him. And before the LGBTQ campaign, there was indeed this campaign over the Central European University, and the terrible persecution that Ignatieff and his his merry band of academic excellence purveyors were suffering. Anyway, so so earlier this week, the media were already getting very excited about the likely success of some of them. That was the whole. Somebody talking about Ignatieff was also supposed to become prime minister of Canada. He stepped into Canadian politics, not with no great success. But then he found his métier as the president of the Central European University. Anyway, there was a lot of excitement earlier this week because everyone was now, very, very thrilled by the likelihood of the release of this money for Ukraine. And this is the headline in the BBC. EU decides on key 90 billion Ukraine loan after pipeline deadlock ends. And then here we have the deadlock is about to come to an end. And then Orban's election defeat last Sunday has cleared the air for the EU, bringing to an end his 16-year era as Hungarian prime minister. Hungary's next leader, Peter Magyar, has prioritized a reset in Budapest's poor relations with Brussels. And then Orban, who is acting as caretaker leader until early next month, made clear at the weekend that as soon as oil deliveries through the pipeline were restored, we will no longer stand in the way of approving the loan. Now, it is true. This has always been the problem with Orban, which is that his policy is neither here nor there. I mean, he sort of said, "Well, we're not going to stand in the way of this loan." Now, it's true that this loan, which is totally fictitious, is structured in such a way that Hungary is not on the hook for when Ukraine obviously fails to repay any of it. I mean, it's so Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic are not one of the creditor states. So Hungary's not going to pay anything. It's everybody else who's going to be on the hook for that money. But at the same time, this money, much of this money, will be used for military purchases. But Zelensky's been told you need to buy your military hardware in Europe. Don't buy your hardware from the United States. That's fantastic. It'll be jobs for Europeans. But nonetheless, it's a way of continuing the war. And since Hungary has rightly said, I think this is a really bad idea to continue the war, then then Hungary, as a matter of principle, should have just simply said, well, we're always going to object to a loan, and it's nothing to do with the Druzhba pipeline. We just object to it because we object to the EU sponsoring a war on our continent, a war that it will inevitably get out of control and will inevitably engulf the entirety of the European continent. I mean, that's the way all wars in Europe have been throughout its history. So why go on pouring money into this this absolutely horrific war? So that would have been a principled position by Orban. I don't know whether it would necessarily have guaranteed his continued political success in Hungary, but at least it would have been understandable. You got to say, yeah, he on principle he objects to Ukraine being in the EU. He objects to pouring more money into Ukraine. He objects to continuing this war against Russia. He objects to the carnage, and he objects to, yet another world war on the European continent, in which Hungary, which is the small country right in the center of Europe, will get clobbered more than anyone else, because it's generally got clobbered worse than anyone else in previous world wars. I mean, that would have been that's a principal position, but instead he made it contingent on the Druzhba pipeline, and I think that Hungarians just had difficulties understanding Orban's foreign policy. I mean, it sort of made sense in a way when you thought about it, but fundamentally, it really didn't. He was just trying to sit on two stools, being a member of EU and NATO, but also trying to be the peacemaker. You're either, and therefore, he's an independent, neutral state. Well, you're either the one thing or the other. But anyway, he announced, even though he didn't go to Cyprus, he declared, "Oh, I see Marty has introduced himself. I got to take a look at this great photograph. Marty's photographs are always great. So here's the photograph. That is Georgia Maloney and the Danish woman, Mette Frederiksen, one of the dumber of the EU women. Yeah, then they're wonderfully. I guess it's from today's meeting in Cyprus. But I've got a better picture, I mean, and I'm going to show you. I've got usually Marty has much better pictures than I have, but I think I have a better one than Marty that I'm going to show in a moment. Throw. Anyway, so they, as this meeting in Cyprus, and the Guardian has actually lists the menu. The menus at these EU gatherings, are always delicious. I mean, you may not want to spend much time with Maloney and Mette Frederiksen and Kaya Kallas, but however, they're serving kind of milk-fed lamb. I don't know what milk-fed lamb is, but it does sound quite nice. So if somebody can perhaps tell me what milk-fed lamb is, but that was on the menu for the EU summit in Cyprus. But anyway, here is this is the Guardian, but here the Guardian, you see, admits, even as it's rejoicing that Hungary has withdrawn its objections to the loan, quote, loan, unquote, and the sanctions, it blithely admits, meanwhile, Ukraine has also targeted oil facilities inside Russia, including a pumping station in Samara region linked to the Druzhba pipeline this week. Huh. Well, that's interesting. I thought, it was all a ridiculous fuss that Orban was making, and making these completely unwarranted charges that Ukraine was trying to sabotage oil deliveries for Hungary. And that turns out, no. So Ukraine has targeted oil facilities inside Russia, including a pumping station in the Samara region linked to the Druzhba pipeline. Orban's decision to renege, it's a reneging, he reneged on last December's agreement to provide Ukraine with a 90 billion euro loan, has infuriated EU leaders who had agreed to give Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic an opt-out from the scheme. Well, he reneged, if you're going to use that word, renege, you reneged because he wasn't getting any oil deliveries, oil that Hungary had paid for. Basically, I mean, Hungary needed the oil. I mean, it's winter, and Hungary needs its oil. And lo and behold, Zelensky suddenly declared, "Well, we just can't repair the pipeline." And then said, "Well, he reneged," and it's infuriated the EU leaders. Heaven forbid to infuriate EU leaders. And here's Kaya Kallas, who sent out this tweet today, really excited. You can see how happy she is. Deadlock over. The EU just cleared the way for the 90 billion euro loan for Ukraine. Loan. Always use that, the wonderful loan. It's just a loan for Ukraine. And the 20th sanctions package. Russia's war economy is under growing strain, while Ukraine is getting a major boost. We will provide Ukraine what it needs to hold its ground until Putin understands his war leads nowhere. So we're going to provide Ukraine with what it needs. And then, of course, von der Leyen got in on the act. And she declares, we are on our way to Cyprus with good news. I welcome the agreement from member states on the 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine for 2026 to 2027 and on 20th sanctions package. So we're already almost into May. So this 90 billion, that's gonna go very quickly. So we're gonna get on to the next, it's gonna be the next 100 billion euro loan. While Russia doubles down on its aggression, we are doubling down on our support to the brave Ukrainian nation, enabling Ukraine to defend itself and putting pressure on Russia's war economy. Now, we will move to swiftly implement on both fronts. And then send out another tweet. I mean, she was, because they were just ecstatic today. So she sends this out. Today is a good day for Europe and Ukraine. Last time I was with you in Kiev, dear Vladimir, I said we would deliver the 90 billion euro loan one way or the other. Today we deliver on this promise. Let me say, we deliver. So this is money, money that actually belongs to, yes, European taxpayers. We, as if it came out of our own personal checking account. So yeah, we delivered. We said we would deliver. We delivered. We delivered. The Europeans, really, European taxpayers have no idea about this. They're fobbed off with stories about loans. They're told about how, we're going to get our hands on this Russian money. I mean, even if they were to get their hands on this Russian money, this 300 billion euros of frozen assets, even if they were to get their hands on that, it wouldn't begin to cover all of the money that has been transferred to Ukraine, with more, promised along the way. So here then is who this for today. We deliver on the promise. And then, of course, we had an excellent meeting with Zelensky in Cyprus today. Ukraine's brave resistance against Russia is unwavering. So is Europe's support. In light of Ukraine's sustained reform effort, accession talks should start without delay. This is all she cares about. She cares about nothing else except Ukraine, President of the European Commission. Anyway, this was the joint statement issued by Antonio Costa, who was the president of the European Council, von der Leyen, and Zelensky. They issued this joint statement, the usual blather, nothing very exciting here. 90 billion euros, so on. So the Ukraine support loan will ensure that Ukraine can meet the budgetary and defense needs, and so on. And then they said the president welcomed the 20th sanctions package. Sanctions will aim to reduce Russia's energy revenues, constrain its banking system, and curb shadow fleet operations. The president underscored the necessity of applying further pressure on Russia to cease its aggression and engage in meaningful negotiations towards peace. And then again, commended the significant progress of Ukraine and so on. And here's Antonio Costa. He's also exultant. Promised, delivered, implemented. The EU's strategy to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine rests on two pillars: strengthening Ukraine, increasing pressure on Russia. That sounds like one pillar, to be honest. I don't know. I mean, I don't quite see that they're two separate pillars. Today we move forward on both, and then again unlocking the 90 billion euro loan and adopting the 20th package. And then here, of course, Politico is thrilled, and then here they talk about the release of this money, and then they quote Zelensky: "The European support loan for Ukraine has been unblocked, 90 billion euros over 2 years." Hungary and Slovakia, who had previously blocked the financial package, failed to object before a 3 p.m. deadline, clearing the final hurdle to approve the loan. And there it is. There's the picture that I was talking about. There they like the three musketeers. They've got clasping hands, one for all and all for one. Von der Leyen, Zelensky, and Costa. 90 billion euros. Just money doesn't belong to any of them. Transferred to Ukraine, pissed away in no time at all, until in a couple of months' time we're going to be talking about the next loan, and then we're going to talk about the 21st sanctions package. Anyway, and then here again, Guardian very excited. EU formally approves 90 billion and so on, and then said, speaking later, von der Leyen said she thought it would be possible to disburse the first tranche of the 45 billion euro funding plan for 2026 in this quarter, meaning by the end of June. The first payment, she indicated, would fund Ukraine's domestic drone production, drones from Ukraine for Ukraine. So the loan, funded by EU borrowing with the intention that Russian reparations will fund repayments, is expected to provide 2/3 of Ukraine's financial needs in 2026 and 2027. So at least they admit here what the plan is. The intention, the Russian reparations will fund repayments. So it's based on this entirely hypothetical, fantastical notion that they're going to get their hands on these frozen assets. But they know that basically every court will rule that, hey, this money does not belong to you. You can't. This is sovereign assets, and nobody can touch other countries' sovereign assets. I mean, that's articulated in I don't know how many international covenants. You simply sovereign assets cannot be touched. So, but they want to maintain this fantasy that somehow one day we're going to get our hands on this money. Anyway, then Hungary has been, and then they're talking about Antonio Costa, who says the next step is to open the first cluster of negotiations for the Ukrainian accession to the EU. Hungary has also been blocking the opening of clusters of negotiating topics that will allow Ukraine to progress its application to join the EU. While other member states support the start of talks, many are also wary of any fast-track procedure for Kiev, which filed its application for EU membership a few days after invasion. Well, they do have, it's true that they are quite wary, but of course, what von der Leyen and the rest of them showed is, well, we're just going to bully you into accepting our terms, because you may just get a little dose of what we gave Hungary. Do you want us to interfere in your domestic affairs the way we did in Hungary? I mean, I don't think anyone denies that the EU got themselves involved in a very big way in the Hungarian election. What with withholding money, with withholding the Erasmus scholarships, what with its interference during the campaign with its disinformation checks. They were running its kind of campaign against, checking up on disinformation, which was only one-sided, because apparently only the government side, the Orban side, was engaging in disinformation, but the EU was, through Facebook, was very actively involved in making sure that there was no disinformation coming from the government side. So so hey, if you want this kind of treatment, they'll say, then then defy us. But anyway, that was the news from the meeting in Cyprus. But to get a full measure of the EU, I'll just show you Kaya Kallas. So Kaya Kallas, here we are. So she announced the other day that the EU will be withholding money to the Venice Biennale. Was it Venice Biennale? I think that's the right way of pronouncing it. No, and because they are going to allow Russian artists to take part. So here's the story in Politico. This Kaya Kallas, there was she's very very interested in art and very scholarly intellectual matters. Anyway, here's the Politico story that says EU to cut Venice Biennale funding over Russia's participation, Kallas says. The Italian art exhibition is set to host Russia for the first time since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And then we have EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaya Kallas said Tuesday that the bloc intends to cut funding to the Venice Biennale following a decision by the art exhibition to readmit Russian artists to its 2026 edition. So notice that all they're doing here, its organizers, is they're readmitting Russian artists. So Russian artists will be allowed to exhibit at an art exhibition. Well, you can't have that. Kaya Kallas, who cares a great deal about art, is outraged that the Russian artists will be allowed to take part. So here Kaya Kallas says, while Russia bombs museums, destroys churches, and seeks to erase Ukrainian culture, it should not be allowed to exhibit its own. But of course, Russia is not exhibiting its own. These are Russian artists. Kallas said after a meeting of EU foreign ministers. Russia's return to the Venice Biennale is morally wrong, and the EU intends to cut its funding. So that's that. But this is the way the EU operates. Like, hey, we don't like this government. We're going to just seize your money. I mean, this is as if this is their money. This belongs to them, their own personal funds. Anyway, so just like no money for Hungary, no money for the Venice Biennale, but apparently money for Ukraine. And then here it says the Venice Biennale, one of the world's most prominent art exhibitions, is set to host Russia for the first time since its full-scale invasion for Ukraine, a move that has sparked widespread criticism across Europe. Criticism among whom? What is this widespread criticism? I live in Europe. I don't notice too many people wandering the streets, agitated that Russian artists will be taking part in the Venice Biennale. Anyway, Latvia's, of course, it's always the Latvians or the Lithuanians. Latvia's culture minister, Agnieszka Lese, who had spearheaded, of course, she spearheaded, who spearheaded a joint position by 25 European countries calling for Russia's exclusion, said she will boycott the Biennale's May the 9th opening if Moscow takes part. So she's not going to take part. Moscow takes part, but I still not clear how is Moscow taking part. These are Russian artists. Anyway, in a statement, Latvia's Ministry of Culture, Latvia is very big on culture. Latvian culture is one of the among the most distinguished in the world. Um, it's I think generally, if there's one thing Latvia is renowned for, and that's the high level of its art. In a statement, Latvia's Ministry of Culture argued that allowing Russia to participate would give legitimacy through a major European cultural platform supported by European funding to a sanctioned aggressor state, would give legitimacy through a major European cultural platform supported by European funding to a sanctioned aggressor state, and warned that individuals linked to the pavilion have ties to Russian state structures and pro Kremlin narratives. So imagine these artists have ties to Russian state structures and pro Kremlin narratives. And then in a letter to Ursula von der Leyen and Kallas, 37 MEPs also urged the EU to suspend funding, estimated at around 2 million euros over 3 years, and consider restrictive measures against individuals linked to the Russian pavilion. That's nice, so not only no funding for the Venice Biennale, but restrictive measures against individuals linked to the Russian pavilion. So, in other words, restrictive measures against Russian artists. Nice. The Biennale has defended its decision, arguing it remains a space for dialogue where art is kept separate from politics. But for a growing number of European policymakers, they're nothing of the sort. For a growing number of European policymakers, Russia's return raises broader questions about whether cultural neutrality is tenable while the war in Ukraine continues. They always say this. Every time they always say this cultural neutrality. Where is it tenable? It only ever applies when Russia is involved. It never applies to anyone else. Cultural neutrality. So I mean, it's a given that no measures are taken against American artists because of what America's doing against Iran. And it's right. There should be no measures taken against American artists. It's a given, and we'll come to that in a moment, that no measures are taken against Israeli artists because of what Israel is doing. That's a given. But so all of this, cultural neutrality. Well, can one be neutral? Is there possible that for cultural neutrality? Well, because of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. But apparently there is when any other country but Russia is involved. And then here we have. Let me just continue here. That while the war in Ukraine continues, and then here, this was quite recent. This was from a few months ago when the issue arose whether Israel should be banned from taking part in the Eurovision Song Contest. Now, Eurovision Song Contest is not exactly high culture, but I guess it is culture. So here it says, Kaja Kallas considers Israel's expulsion from Eurovision a mistaken measure. And here we have the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, rejected calls for a Eurovision boycott due to Israel's participation, stressing that such actions are mistaken and in practice punish the Israeli people. So that's the point. You can't punish the Israeli people. You can't punish any people with the exception of the Russian people. And she was the one who said, when she was basically said we should ban visas to Russians over the policies of their government so that Russians don't get to visit Europe, and said, well, visiting Europe is a privilege. It's not a right. So she has absolutely no hesitation about punishing the Russian people, but you can't punish the Israeli people. During a press conference in Brussels, Callas was asked about the decision of 5 countries: Spain, the Netherlands, Ireland, Slovenia, and Iceland, to withdraw from the Eurovision Song Contest if Israel takes part. She responded, "All these measures that essentially aim to punish the Israeli people, I believe they are mistaken and we do not support them." At the same time, the EU announced a package of sanctions against Israel over the situation in Gaza. These include sanctions against extremist ministers. So they always do this, extremist ministers, sanctions. So we'll just, not against the Israeli government, but we'll just pick a couple of ministers that we don't like, or the settlers, the most extreme of the settlers. That avoids us that we're imposing any real sanctions against Israel. These sanctions include these include sanctions against extremist ministers in the Israeli government and the removal of trade preferences for Israeli products. Our goal is not to punish Israel or its people, but to put real pressure on the government to change course and end the human suffering in Gaza, the Estonian politician explained. All right, so you can see that apparently the only people that it's permissible to punish is the Russian people. And of course, the reason is because, well, they're savages. I mean, I think they obviously just, that's, but the way Kaja Kallas, the Estonian, the privileged Estonian, who lived a very, very nice life, and her family lived an extremely nice life in the Soviet Union, far above, a status. They enjoyed the status and the standing in the Soviet Union, far above their accomplishments. But she has had this second career as the most rabid of Russophobes. And so there she is. Hey, no money for the Venice Biennale. I imagine the Venice Biennale will cave. I mean, people always cave when there's money involved. Um, and that's just the way the EU operates. They you don't follow the line, you get clobbered. It's as if it's their money. Anyway, on Tuesday, I did promise that I wanted to talk about this an intellectual debate. I mean, it's quite an interesting intellectual debate that has broken out in France ahead of the French presidential election of next year between Dominique de Villepin, who's a Gaullist, and Eric Zemmour, who's a kind of is a sort of right wing nationalist intellectual. If you recall, we talked about Zemmour a little bit ahead of the 2022 presidential election, because there now were these essentially two kind of right-wing populist nationalist candidates. There was Le Pen and the National Rally, and then there was Eric Zemmour. So Eric Zemmour has often been described as the French Trump, but the only reason he's described as the French Trump because he appears a lot on television. And so, in the sort of usual mindless way of journalists, well, what do you say? Well, he's the French Trump. He's on television. Trump was on television, so he's obviously Trump. Just like they describe Boris Johnson in 2019 as the British Trump. Well, because Boris Johnson had blonde hair, Trump has kind of blonde hair, and therefore Boris Johnson is the British Trump. But Zemmour, I mean, if you're going to try and liken him to a comparable figure in the United States, he's more like the French Pat Buchanan. He's a kind of an intellectual. I mean, not particularly deep intellectual, but nonetheless, he's an intellectual, and he's a controversialist. Like Pat Buchanan was a controversialist. He espouses kind of nationalist, populist ideas, unfashionable. So he annoys the bien-pensants who dominate France, who dominate the French media, dominate the French academy, the French legal profession. So he kind of annoys them by advocating for ideas again that distinctly unfashionable. But Villepin, you'll probably recall, was it became famous uh, in the run up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq because France and Germany, both Germany at the time was ruled. This was the pre Angela Merkel day. This was ruled by Gerhard Schroeder, and Schroeder said he was against the whole Iraq adventure. And France, then ruled by President Chirac, said he was also against it. And when George W. Bush went before the UN Security Council to try to get the UN Security Council authorization for the invasion of Iraq, he was suddenly confronted by no less than three permanent members of the Security Council who were going to veto any resolution to support the United States. And of course, the neoconservatives in the United States went absolutely crazy, and then they started coining the terminology, the French surrender monkeys. You remember the French surrender monkeys. And then we're not going to call them French fries anymore. We'll call them freedom fries. They somehow, for some reason, America believed that they were entitled to expect France to support the United States. And but the man who kind of led the French opposition to the American endeavor was Dominique de Villepin, and he quickly became this kind of an international celebrity. He had that perfectly coiffed gray hair. He looked very smooth. Looks like a Frenchman who enjoys money, enjoys the good life, eats in fine restaurants, probably has a very nice apartment somewhere close to the Champs-Elysees. You think it's kind of the idea. He lives the kind of idea of the perfect French life. It's like, hey, I want to live like that. So anyway, he was believed that he would have a big future ahead of him. And what was striking about it, and which I think may have gone a little bit to de Villepin's head, was that he got a huge kind of standing ovation from many of the countries of Asia and Africa, because suddenly he was speaking on their behalf, though he was a Gaullist. And then he was foreign minister, then he became interior minister, and then he became prime minister. But in France, being a prime minister really doesn't mean a great deal. I mean, France is a presidential system. It's the president who counts. So prime ministers just come and go, and no one even knows who the French prime minister is at any particular time. The president appoints them. They usually fail, and then they're fired. But nonetheless, because of the splash that he made with his very eloquent denunciation of America's plan to invade Iraq, he was thought to have a big future ahead of him in French politics. And but it didn't turn out that way. In 2007, the left did not win, and when they were expected to win, but the left did not win, and the election was won not by somebody on the right, but not by de Villepin, but by Sarkozy, and he was, of course, largely a failure as prime minister. And then Sarkozy was succeeded by François Hollande, who was also a complete failure. But in 2012, de Villepin did make an attempt to run for the French presidency, but it was an absolute fiasco. He failed to get the way the French system works. You're supposed to win the support of 500 French elected officials. So you need to get the endorsement of 500 French nationally elected officials. So it could be mayors or councillors, whatever. And he didn't get that. So basically, his name wasn't on the ballot. And And so, but now, I mean, this is really his last, his last hurrah. He's obviously preparing for another attempt to run for president. So he has now made his pitch to for as what the platform is going to run on. So he's obviously as back in 2002 he's going to be running on a kind of an anti-American imperialist platform. Um, Now Zemmour himself is no fan of America. He also doesn't like America very much. So that's a given. But there is a difference, and between the two, and the difference is that when back, as I say, in 2002, when de Villepin was making his pitch about against the Bush plan to invade Iraq, he became a hero in among the peoples of Asia and Africa. And I think he sort of really wants to go on being a hero to Asians and Africans. Zemmour is definitely not enamored of Asians and Africans. In fact, he's very strongly against immigration, very strongly against the Islamification of France. He wants to control immigration, but he also wants to eliminate Islamic influence from France. So de Villepin suddenly sent out this kind of lengthy message. It was a kind of a video message, but then he expressed the message of the video through a series of tweets, and Zemmour responded to that. One thing I should just simply say about, as I say, Zemmour himself is, I mean, his family is kind of, he's a Jew. He comes from Algeria. His family was from Algeria, but he himself was born in France, and he so again, it's very kind of interesting. Again, there's a Jew from Algeria, grew up in France, French nationalist. But as I said, he's a controversialist in that he has challenged some of the shibboleths of French liberal thought. One of the most contentious, I mean, it's been said by others, but nonetheless, he took up the cry, was he called into question the innocence of Captain Alfred Dreyfus. So we don't need to go through the complexity of the Dreyfus affair in France, but suffice to say that this became a rallying cry for French liberals. That Dreyfus, obviously, this French Jew, was innocent. He was framed by an anti-Semitic French state. He didn't spy for Germany as he was accused, and so that's the it was the rallying cry for French liberals or French leftists for the next 100 years and more. Now, of course, there were others who called into question his innocence, the anti-Dreyfusards, and then one of if you recall the book that we had on the Gaggle book club, I think maybe about a year ago, which was Esau's Tears, and by Lindemann, and that book kind of called into question the self-evident nature of Dreyfus's innocence. I mean, the book made no claim that he was innocent or he was guilty, but the book nonetheless went into some detail about the Dreyfus affair and said it isn't obvious now. I mean, it's very hard, so many years later, that Dreyfus was innocent. It just was. It's not obvious, and therefore it was not his conviction was not an unreasonable one. So that was, and that's more or less the claim that Eric Zemmour is making. But that of course, very much goes against the grain of French intellectuals, French, historians, French, American, English historians who take it as a given that Dreyfus was obviously innocent. So that's one thing that aroused a great deal of controversy when Zemmour has said, yeah, basically, I don't know whether he was innocent or guilty, but it isn't obvious to me that Dreyfus was framed. There was enough evidence to suggest that he may well have been spying for Germany. So that's one thing, and then of course there was the other thing with Zemmour was on the role of Marshal Pétain. So again, Gagglers will recall that we posted as a part of the Gaggle book club a book about the trial of Marshal Pétain. And Pétain, of course, he was the leader of Vichy France, and then he was put on trial at where he was already Gaga by the time he was put on trial, and he was of course found guilty, but it didn't really matter very much because he really didn't even know where he was by then. And so again, please look it up. It's on the Gaggle, along with Esau's Tears and the trial of Pétain. But anyway, Zemmour claims, again, plenty of people have made this claim before, but as I say, he's a controversialist, and it's unusual for a presidential candidate, somebody who aspires to lead France, to claim that Pétain, saved French Jews from the Holocaust. Now he does accept that the foreign Jews who were living in France, in wartime France, were indeed deported to the death camps, but he insists that the French Jews were not, and that pretty much all of the French Jews were saved. And then he says, well, for that, Pétain should be thanked by the French people. That in other words, that if you add up all the Jews who were living in France, the French Jews and the foreign Jews, 75% of all Jews living in France in 1940 were saved. And he said, well, we should express gratitude to Pétain. So that was obviously caused a lot of controversy. He was fined. He has been fined, and courts have ruled against him because there's not much freedom of speech in France. So when you say things like that, the courts rule, and they hit you with fines. I mean, he has money and so on. But nonetheless, I mean, don't expect a free, vigorous debate in France. You go against the grain, you get thumped by the courts. Anyway, so by way of introduction, so let's just first of all look at what it was that de Villepin said, and then how Zemmour responded to it. And here he is. What if Europe, in colonizing, what is it, de Villepin? What if Europe, in colonizing the world, had also damaged itself? What if the work of decolonization began first from within, in our gaze, in our words, in our habits of thought? So you can see how it's getting quite lyrical. These are the questions posed by Aimé Césaire in his discourse on colonialism. He's a kind of famous kind of communist, and he became an ex-communist, kind of leftist academic, writer, very prominent in France in the 20th century. By turning peoples into objects, lands into spoils, Europe has barbarized itself. Now, right away, you're puzzled by why we're talking about colonialism. I mean, there's no more colonialism. I mean, there are no more colonies. Europeans, they had colonies, then they gave them up. So in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they basically gave up their colonies. So it becomes very strange as to why you suddenly talking about colonialism. Anyway, first lesson of this text: a civilization is judged by the way it treats those it might seek to crush. Then it goes on. Second lesson: language is a battlefield. Cesar takes aim at words that numb, like those civilizing missions, which in reality are a methodical enterprise of dehumanization. Okay, so civilizing mission, which is how imperialists justified what they did, and which in reality are a methodical enterprise of dehumanization. He imposes an iron discipline on us to name things with precision, or to misname the unacceptable is to allow it to take shape under cover of respectability. Well, all of this seems like a fairly empty kind of argument because, as I say, I mean, there's no more colonialism. And the 19th century, it was believed that because the West had reached such enormous, had made such great strides in science and technology, and in rule of law and so on, that it had a civilizing mission. The rest of the world hadn't accepted many of these things, and therefore it had a right and indeed a duty to educate the rest of mankind and to raise them up to the level of the West. So all the various ideals, liberal ideas, French Revolution ideas, all these wonderful things, along with science and technology, all of this, we have a civilizing mission. Now, you can make fun of it now and say how ridiculous it is. And yeah, okay, it was ridiculous. It was arrogant. One can say that this arrogance has continued, but it doesn't express itself in colonialism, but nonetheless, the arrogance that continues. But that was then. I mean, we're not living in the 19th century anymore. So it seems like, okay, the people of the 19th century did believe they had a duty, not just a right, but a duty to raise up the rest of humanity to the level of the Western man, who was thought to have reached the dizzying heights, like the end of history, like the Fukuyama celebrated in 1989. Anyway, but he continues in this somewhat sanctimonious vein. Third lesson: the universal is not a mask of variable geometry. There are no human rights that stop at borders or skin color. To accept that some are less human than others is to permit the destruction of the entire edifice of our dignity. Well, this of course gets into somewhat tendentious areas, because you don't really say that some are less human than others. You say that some have not reached the highest level of civilization. Hey, here's a society which still practices slavery. Well, we've no longer practiced slavery, so we have a duty to educate them that slavery is wrong. Or here's a society, they still practice cannibalism, so it's a duty to show that cannibalism is wrong. I mean, it's not less human, but in like grown-ups teach children. Grown-ups have a responsibility, a right, and a duty to teach children what is and what is not appropriate. Anyway, the fourth lesson finally is that indifference is complicity. Colonialism thrives in the habits and comfort of consciences that accommodate distant suffering. As soon as another's life becomes a statistic or a file, we prepare the bed for future barbarities. To read Cesar today is an act of absolute vigilance. It is to refuse the reification in all its forms, whether economic or security driven, and to hold all of humanity as the sole measure, so as never again to let force become law. All of this is kind of very much the intellectual kind of verbiage. So, you're familiar with reification. Anyway, anyone who went to college, well, who has been to college will remember expressions like reification and instrumentality and whatnot. It's odd to come across this kind of language from an ostensible right winger. He's a goalist, but that's kind of French intellectual life. Um, and anyway, so it's an act of absolute vigilance. Um, reification of all its forms, whether economic or security driven, and to hold all of humanity as the sole measure, so as never again to let force become law. I love it when we talk about all of humanity. I speak for all of humanity. Anyway, here's Zemmour's response. And he says, "Mirror, oh mirror, tell me who is the most beautiful. Tell me who is the greatest, the most intelligent, the most generous. Tell me who is the most humanist, the most universalist, the most anti-racist, the most anti-colonialist." Dominique de Villepin admires himself in his mirror. What do you have to say? That's correct. And so what if he takes historical reality down with him? And so what if he spits on France, its history, and its children who gave their lives for her? And then displaying his hatred of colonization more than half a century after decolonization is so easy and so comfortable. Well, that's right. I mean, it's like you're breaking into an empty door. There is no more colonialism, so there's no point in railing against colonialism. It's gone. Just like people railing against Hitler. Hitler's gone. There is no more Hitler. You don't get brownie points for being against Hitler. More than half a century after decolonization is so easy and so comfortable that one must absolutely not deprive oneself of it. Demagoguery has laws that must be known and to which one must submit. Of course, Dominique de Villepin only speaks of colonization by the French and the Europeans. That's very important, because it's clear, from the way he's quoting César, that he is only speaking of colonization as something was perpetrated by Europeans, even though colonialism is as old as history itself. He superbly ignores Arab and Muslim colonization across half the planet, the colonizations carried out by African tribes on their neighbors, or the colonizations between Asian peoples. And then, if colonization is a crime against humanity, as Macron said before Villepin, then all men from all eras and all countries are criminals. All peoples have colonized and all have been colonized. All peoples have felt superior because they showed themselves at some point in their history to be the strongest. All peoples have believed that their gods or their beliefs were superior because they won a battle. It is the law of humanity. And that, of course, is correct. If you win a battle, you naturally think, well, you didn't just win because you fought better. Your tactics were superior or your weapons were superior. It was because you were a better person. You were more advanced, more sophisticated. You were a better human being. It's nothing. That's as old as the hills. And somebody says they should put back character limits on tweets. Yeah, there's something to that. Yeah, but anyway, he goes goes on. Yeah, all peoples have believed that their gods or their beliefs are superior because they won a battle. It is the law of humanity. The specificity of Europe is to have universalized the world. It is apparently what Villepin reproaches it for. Amusing for someone who claims to be a universalist and a humanist. Yes, the Europeans for a few centuries, starting from the Renaissance, had such technical, scientific, military, and political superiority that they conquered the world. Villepin reproaches the Europeans for having colonized other peoples in the name of their civilizing missions. He disowns Victor Hugo, who said that we were the Greeks of the world, we bring light to peoples in darkness. Villepin is not one to shy away from disownment. He disowns all the hospitals, the schools, the roads, the drained marshes, the railroads, the oil wells, everything that the European colonizer left to the peoples he dominated. What have they left of the sort when they prove to be the strongest? But Villepin knows nothing of none of this. His anti-colonial diatribe has only one goal: to please the many voters who savor with delight this decolonial discourse, immigrants or children of immigrants who reject France, or young students nursed on hatred of their country. He comes to compete with Jean-Luc Mélenchon on his favorite playground. These two make a fine pair. They claim to take up the mantle of our great men. Villepin has donned the general's tunic and kepi of de Gaulle, while Mélenchon places the wig of Robespierre on his head. They take up figures from our history, but not the ones they think. They embody the eternal return of the party of the stranger, those French who throughout our history have taken the side of France's enemies to fight the French. And the craziest thing in all of this is that Dominique de Villepin offers us a text against colonization, precisely to please the new colonizers. For what are colonizers if not foreigners who settle on a land foreign to them? And instead of adopting the customs and cultures of the indigenous people, they would then be immigrants on the path to assimilation, impose their customs, their culture, their clothing, their God, in short, their civilization. It is exactly what the Europeans did in Algeria, in Africa, in the Indies, or in America. And it is exactly what Dominique de Villepin vehemently reproaches them for. To vehemently denounce the colonization of yesterday is to pledge allegiance to the colonization of today. All right, so now you get the point. Where this is going? He is he's saying, well, yeah, you're denouncing European colonialism. That's fine, fantastic. You're against European colonialism, but you're doing it in the name of embracing a kind of an anti-European narrative. And who are the purveyors of this anti-European narrative? Well, the colonizers of today. And who are the colonizers of today? Well, they're the people from Asia and Africa who are making their home in France and in the rest of Europe. And it's these people who refuse to be assimilated, so they don't want to be assimilated, these people, and who are acting as colonizers, because it says, well, what are colonizers? The colonizers are the very people who don't adopt the habits and practices of the indigenous people. They retain their own sense of superiority, and they don't want to assimilate. And who are they? Well, they're the people who have basically colonized France. So he's saying that de Villepin, supposedly the right winger, the Gaullist, this de Villepin is essentially making a pitch to these people in the name of anti-colonialism. So in the name of anti-colonialism, he's making a pitch to France's Muslim population. France's Muslim population may well be something like 12, 15%. It's a big voting bloc. So when this guy, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, kind of the leader of the left, he is making a pitch to this very sizable voting bloc. And people do that in the UK as well. They figured out this Muslim population. This is a real major voting bloc, and they make a direct appeal to them. In Britain, it's a little different. They talk there about Israel and Palestine, but they know exactly their target audience. So what de Villepin is doing, suddenly bringing up out of nowhere colonialism, is making this anti-European pitch, because he only means colonialism is only something that's being that was practiced by the Europeans. So it's essentially appealing to this Muslim population. Well, look at the evils of European colonialism. And so Zemmour responds by saying, you're in the name of anti-colonialism, you are appealing to today's colonizers. These are today's colonizers. They've come here to France, and they basically intend to run the place at some point. Anyway, that was Zemmour's response to the Villepin's um, tweet flurry, and then of course de Villepin responded to Zemmour, and here he is, Monsieur Eric Zemmour. Unlike you, I love all of France. I have always loved it, with its flaws, with its wanderings, with the dark side of its history. I love France because it is capable of confronting its history and owning it, because it moves forward, because it is great enough to look at itself without makeup. That is what greatness is, and that has always been the strength of Gaullism. Not to ask history to absolve us, but to compel us. There was a time when the word greatness still spoke to you. This was before the renunciation for you, Eric Zemmour. History no longer holds exigence for you, but an alibi. You now offer only a morbid nostalgia, the adoration of a made up corpse, like those lost souls who, one February 1973, carted the corpse of Marshal Pétain from the Ile d'Yeu to a suburban bungalow in Paris, burdened at the end by that piece of history still too grand for them. This was a ridiculous event in '73. Essentially, it was an attempt to rebury Pétain. These are kind of people who still worship Pétain, so they took his body with a view to reburying Pétain. So anyway, the spotless France that you parade on your stages has only one flaw: it never existed. On this path of denial, there is only provocation, travesty, the illusion of greatness. There are only ghosts like Pétain, supposedly the savior of French Jews, as you have claimed, or colonization elevated to the rank of the law of humanity. Now, you can already see that it's a problem for any politician. If you're planning to run the president of a country, you need to be extolling the glories of that country. Um, if you're just talking about the negative and all the negative features of its history, because of course every country has many negative aspects. French history, like British history, American history, it has its negative moments. It has obviously its great moments as well. But if you're going to make a pitch only emphasizing the negative aspects of the history, well, I don't think you're going to get too many people voting for you. You might get the Muslim vote. I mean, there might well be a kind of a competition now between the Villepin and Mélenchon for the Muslim vote, but you're not going to get most of France because, Frenchmen, like Englishmen, like Americans, they want to hear positive things about their country. I mean, it is their country. They want to feel good about it. They want to be proud of their country, proud of their country's history. It's not, that was Trump's smartness when he in 2016, when he started extolling the virtues, the glories of America, make America great again, and which was a contrast to the Obama's message, Obama's apology tour and everything else. Obama was swept into power by, people fell in love with the idea of Obama rather than the reality of Obama. People fell in love with the idea of, finally electing a black man as president. This was a historic breakthrough, but the people weren't really listening sufficiently to his message, which was a divisive message, and one that was actually very negative about America. And Obama did have a very jaundiced view of America. So it was a refreshing when Trump then made his pitch in 2015 and 2016 as extolling the virtues of America. But here he is, then you start talking about Petain and so on, and then, oh well, you don't really see the negative aspects of French history the way I do. Hmm. Anyway, let's just go on for a bit more. And anyway, that was this. This is there are only ghosts like Petain, supposedly the savior of French Jews, as you have claimed, or colonization elevated to the rank of a law of humanity. And then you tamper with words like one falsifies archives, so that violence appears as order and fault takes on the face of achievement. Your argument rests on the deliberate confusion of migration, conquest, and colonization. I have never contested that other forms of colonization existed in history any more than it is a matter of denying that there still exist in 2026 at the gates of the Near East. The point is to be rigorous. Three criteria characterize colonization: the displacement of a significant population from a metropolitan territory, the establishment of a distinct institutional political power imposed on indigenous population, the maintenance of a political risk, often asymmetrical with the original metropole, and this refusal of definition allows you to negate the specificity of European colonization. So yes, he essentially admits here, having first denied that I didn't mean to suggest that other peoples were not also colonizers. No, I didn't say the Europeans were the only ones who were colonizers. And then he defines colonialism as something that only applies to European colonialism. Um, and this refusal definitely allows you to negate the specificity of European colonization, an ideology of double standards that allows one to affirm at once the law of democracy and the law of domination over the natives. It is the law of the strongest, but doubled with the guard of good conscience of civilizing mission and the promise never kept to grant the same rights to all. Um, well, that wasn't really the idea behind colonialism. I mean, colonialism was supposedly, again, yes, the civilizing mission, but the civilizing mission, the idea behind it was that this would be a temporary measure. Maybe that was dishonest, but nonetheless, it was that, well, I mean, it was, but Hegel famously in his philosophy of history said that, well, more advanced civilizations were carriers of an idea, and therefore they had an opportunity, or they had the obligation as the carriers of a higher idea to subjugate others in order to raise them up. I mean, that was a Hegel's idea. Hegel articulated this 19th century idea of imperialism. I mean, we don't hold to that now, at least not explicitly. But the idea behind it was, well, if we're the carriers of a higher civilization, then we can't just allow other people to stew in their own juice. I mean, you know hear of people living in poverty, and the you know they're barely, they haven't even invented the wheel yet, or that living barely subsistence existence. So we have a responsibility to raise them up. I mean, that was the idea behind it. I mean, so because hey, there's something wrong with allowing people essentially to barely survive. With their with life expectancy, or whatever, 30 years of age. So that's like therefore that was the idea behind it. You can think that they think it's ridiculous, but nonetheless, that was the idea. Now, the issue of the higher idea, well, that was the idea of civilization. You got so you have the civilizations that suddenly, which was in the case of Europe, and I think that Zemmour kind of points out, suddenly, hey, in almost all fields, science, education, law, and of course, weapons, they were able to dominate the rest of the world. But the idea was that, well, you kind of move people up in a a lot of people will themselves acquire this the higher idea, and anyway, so then he just goes on in this somewhat pretentious way. Um, Anyway, so then it goes, there is moreover an incoherence in your argument, since you pride yourself on the supposed benefits of the civilization brought the colonized people. Why not in turn rejoice at what you describe as colonization, or at the very least, pushing things to the absurd? Should you not conclude that the great migratory flows from the French colonial empire are the ransom of glory? This is a kind of a dishonest argument. He says, well, since you're extolling the virtues of the kind of the European colonialism, because of all the things that they brought, like the rule of law and science, technology, raising life expectancy and all the rest. Well, why don't you celebrate all the glories brought by the new colonialism? Well, nobody said that all colonialism brings benefits. Um, that is the argument. Some colonialism obviously brings benefits. Some that don't. Some colonialism involve enslavement. Some colonialism involves barbarity. Anyway, for my part, I choose coherence. I consider that colonization was a fault yesterday, and I refuse to let France become today an American digital colony or a Chinese industrial colony. And then I question this need to invert the stigma, to make the colonized the new colonizers, to reverse the roles of executioners and victims. How can one see anything in it other than a sense of guilt that gnaws at you? You tell us, in essence, everyone colonizes everyone, so in the end, no hard feelings. What you call your love of France, is it not at bottom a great fear of history's revenges? So again, it's so suggestions that, history's revenges. So it's reasonable that somebody should revenge France, not something that's likely to win you too many votes in France. Anyway, I mean that reconciliation is possible, a reconciliation of people and memories. It does not demand repentance, but the work of truth. Aimé Césaire said it with force. Colonization degrades the colonized, but it also corrupts the colonizer. It is not only domination of bodies, a degradation of the gaze, habituation to inequality, pedagogy of humiliation. Sounds like more like kind of Jean-Paul Sartre rather than a Gaullist. Anyway, um, uh, then we have Zemmour responds, Monsieur Dominique de Villepin, I could have begun my response as you did. Unlike you, I love all of France. I have always loved it with all its faults, its wanderings, and its dark sides. It is afterward that we diverge, afterward that you betray your introductory premise, afterward that you betray France. My difference with you is simple. I do not beat my breast in contrition on behalf of those who made France. There was a time when Napoleon's grand example spoke to you. I, for my part, have remained faithful to his teaching from Clovis to the Committee on Public Safety. I take it all upon myself. In other words, I accept all of French history, from its glories to its nadirs. And to assume it does not mean to approve. To assume means to try to understand rather than dispense lessons in morality. To assume means to refuse to spit on France, to please those who hate it, and take pleasure in sullying its memory. To assume, as the English say, right or wrong, my country. Let's take your example. You give us a definition of colonization that aims to be precise and restrictive. Despite yourself, it proves that the invasion of our country is undergoing, has already surpassed the critical stage of colonization to enter that of the Great Replacement. I remind you, that it was precisely to prevent his village from becoming Combe les two mosques that General de Gaulle, the other great man we both admire, I believe, granted independence to Algeria. And today there are indeed two mosques that encircle the general's village. That's very, very important because, the issue is, why did de Gaulle essentially, de Gaulle was brought to power by the French military in Algeria because they thought he would support their goal of retaining Algeria, but instead he moved to grant Algeria independence. And so he said, well, why did he do that? Well, he said, if we hold on to Algeria, if we incorporate Algeria into France, then essentially France will eventually become a Muslim country. I said, it's precisely in order to avoid France becoming a Muslim country that we have to let Algeria go. And he this is what the point said. Well, he said, well, that was de Gaulle's argument as to why do we let go of France, even Algeria, even though that was the reason why he was brought back to power in 1958. Supposedly, he was going to hold on to Algeria in perpetuity. The French military brought de Gaulle back to power. Well, he said, no, we're not going to do it. And he essentially turned his back on the French generals who brought him to power and said, no, we cannot become a Muslim country, and so we have to let Algeria go. Anyway, that was Zemmour's point. Where are we? Yep. And so anyway, two mosques, indeed two mosques that encircle the general's village. You claim that not criminalizing colonization requires accepting in return the migratory invasion on the colonizer's soil. You call this the ransom of glory. In other words, accepting this invasion as a deserved fatality. Do you truly believe what you say? What you call the ransom of glory, I call a will for revenge, against which one protects oneself, against which one defends oneself. It's less lyrical and emphatic, but it's more realistic. Anyway, finally, here you are playing psychoanalyst at the corner tabac about my so-called will to invert the stigma to make victims into executioners and the colonizers. Colonize into colonizers, you say, do not misunderstand me. Do not project your feelings of guilt onto me. I am not, for my part, perceived as a colonist son by the inhabitants of Morocco, where you were born. My ancestors had lived on Algerian soil for centuries. When they saw that magnificent French army disembark, which liberated them from Arab and Muslim colonization. See what he's saying here? The French liberated the Jews from Arab and Muslim colonization. They had endured for 1,000 years. I therefore harbor no feeling of guilt, but rather an eternal gratitude towards France, which brought me liberty, equality, fraternity, French culture, and its art of living. Everyone, yes, everyone, regardless of their religion, could follow the same French path as my family. Those who did not simply chose not to. And then to become French is to take France's side. Even in the past, French people of Italian origin do not reproach France for the canons of Francois I. French people of Spanish origin do not demand apologies for the excesses of Napoleon's Grande Armée. The rest is propaganda, a rewriting of history in service of a thirst for revenge, of which you make yourself a complacent conduit. The question now is whether one submits to the law of numbers, of resentment and violence, whether one defends the right of the French to live on their land and perpetuate their identity, their culture, in short, their civilization. Anyway, so that I think it's kind of an interesting argument. I think de Villepin's pitch, and he seems to have really embraced this whole, I don't know, third worldism or whatever one calls it, this thing that he's going to become the hero to the Asians and Africans and Muslims, and so he somehow feels that I don't know, the Islamification of France is appropriate punishment for the crimes that France had perpetrated. And so I think that's a losing message. I don't think, you know, the left can make that message. Jean-Luc Mélenchon can make that message. I don't think you can do it as a goal list. So my prediction, I think, is that the Villepin's last attempt to run for president is will be as futile as his attempt to do so in 2012. So I think his moment came and went in 2002 when he suddenly you know, captured the world's imagination with his performance at the UN Security Council. But this attempt to become the hero to you know, to the third world, I don't think I don't think that's going to work for him. Anyway, let's now turn to the Gaggle Locals board, and you know, these are the people who, as I say, keep the Gaggle community going. These are people who keeps, you know, us in clover. At least keeps the dogs in clover. You know, they, you know, try, you know, they support the journalism that we do here. You know, the live streams, the podcasts, everything that we do here. So really appreciate the Gaggle community who continue to fund us. Thank you so much. And as I always say, those who lurk in the YouTube and watch it on YouTube, obviously you're very welcome to do so. But if you want me to address your questions and you know, answer your comments, you know, address any criticisms, then please join the Gaggle community. It's a great community. You know, with always interesting material. You know, every day there's, you know, really interesting, fascinating postings by our first um, poster Danaki, and we have, you know, musical experts, we have film experts. So it's, you know, there's, you learn a great deal by being a member of the Gaggle community. So how to join? Go to the gaggle.locals.com. So, and there, I think you won't regret joining the Gaggle. Anyway, Danaki says, "Happy Name Day, George. Thank you so much. It is indeed St. George's Day. So, thank you so much." And I have to say, until I've returned to Hungary, I've never really thought about Name Day. I mean, it's a very big deal here in Hungary, but never, you know, never really thought about it until I've come to Hungary and realized that it is as big a day as your birthday. So that's nice. So you're gonna, you know, 2 days to celebrate. Anyway, thank you so much, Danaki, and thank you obviously for all of your myriad postings. They're really great. And Robert, thank you so much, Robert, for your generosity. And Robert says, didn't Lyndon Johnson remark about not wanting to wake up and discover some son of a bitch had mashed the button? Who'd have thunk that son of a bitch would turn out to be Trump, who, if you believe Larry Johnson's claim, tried to access nuclear launch codes during an Iran crisis meeting, but fortunately was blocked by General Kane. Yeah, I heard that, and it's obviously it's interesting. It's certainly something you might think Trump would do that. I don't know that I necessarily believe all of Larry Johnson's claims. I mean, I know Larry Johnson worked in intelligence and so on, but nonetheless, he's been out of that world for many years. But and he uses his links to the world of intelligence to suggest that he's privy to some really, you know, real to scoops and real fascinating. You know, intelligence revelations. So I thought it was interesting what Larry Johnson said. I don't know that I necessarily believe it. Um, you know, his options, of course, in Iran are running out. However, I do think that um, continuing with what he's doing now, which is maintaining the blockade, probably will serve him well for the time being. I don't think he's going to want to do anything really reckless, at least for a while. I think he's going to see whether the blockade um, will, um, will deliver the goods, will somehow bring Iran to its knees. I think he's going to continue with that for a little while, but when the blockade fails to have the desired effects, as it inevitably will, because blockades are effective as a weapon of war, but they do take time to take effect. I mean, they were in the end they did bring Imperial Germany to its knees, but that takes a couple of years. There are all sorts of ways that Iran can get around the blockade, so it's going to take him years. When Trump realizes that the blockade isn't going to deliver the good, it's going to fail, like the bombing failed, then it'll be interesting. What does Trump do then? Um, I mean, I still think that the most likely option will be to escalate via some form of an invasion. Um, I don't think, maybe I'm being naive here, but I don't think he's going to go for the nuclear option. But he may. He may decide that might do the job. But the problem with, even if you do go for the nuclear option, is that might be as ineffective as the blockade and as the bombing campaign, because if it's an existential matter, if the leaders of Iran are determined to survive, then they will survive the use of a nuclear weapon, just as I think they will be determined to survive the attempt to starve them into submission and the attempt to bomb them into submission. So anyway, I think that may still happen, but I don't know whether what Larry said is necessarily true. I think it's just very interesting. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And Marty's always got these great pictures. And here's a picture of von der Leyen. Oh, that's a face from the past. Annalena Baerbock. So there they are. There's both of whom want war, more war, more. We want more war rather than less. Neither of whom, because they're both women, neither of whom will be called upon to fight. So it's always great when you have women banging their fist on the table, demanding more war, more killing, more sacrifices, when they know that they'll continue to do their shopping for their nice outfits, and they will never have to go anywhere. And there's the back of von der Leyen, not von der Leyen, the back of Kaya Kallas and Annalena Baerbock. That's so nice. Both always very nicely turned out. Baerbock a little less than the colors. Anyway, thank you so much, Marty. Always appreciated. And there's another picture. Oh God, this is a picture from Marty of Maloney really giving vent about something. She seems really pissed in his yelling at something, looking very unattractive and very unchic there. That's interesting. And then Marty. Now Marty has now posted this picture of this Cezanne that allegedly has been identified as hanging behind Zelensky. So there was a major heist a couple of months ago in Italy. Some really priceless artworks were stolen, one of which was the Cezanne painting. And then there was a report that the Cezanne painting was seen hanging behind Zelensky. Now, the report that is cited is claimed to be a BBC report. But if you listen to this report, this alleged BBC report, it doesn't sound like a BBC reporter. It sounds like one of these fake artificial voices that you get on AI. It's kind of with a weird accent and a kind of a weird, weak voice. So I am a little doubtful that this story is true. Um, I've seen these references on the internet, and that the Zelensky sitting there, and behind him is this Cezanne painting. I'm not sure whether this isn't just AI generated. Good story, a fantastic story. Major heist in Italy. Priceless paintings, and then lo and behold, it ends up hanging behind Zelensky. And then there's supposedly a report about this by the BBC. But as I say, if you listen to this report, it doesn't sound like a BBC report. It doesn't sound like someone who is working for the BBC. And then the report cites some kind of an art expert in the couple, but the art expert isn't confirming that this Cezanne has been located to Zelensky's palace. So I remain a little skeptical about this, that either whether this really happened, or whether this whole story is just AI generated. So, if you can provide me more evidence, stronger confirmation than that kind of quote BBC report, which doesn't sound like a BBC report, then, but until then, I'm going to be a little skeptical that this happened. Not that I don't think Zelensky wouldn't help himself to a Cezanne if he got the chance, but I don't think even he would be stupid enough to appear with this stolen painting right behind him. So, but anyway, thank you for bringing to our attention this the story of the missing Cezanne. Anne Marie, always good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie, for very, very, very generous of you. Anne Marie, as I say, is our extraordinary musical talent, was really, plays with amazingly talented orchestras of international renown, who's worked with very famous and outstanding composers and conductors, performed in amazing places. I mean, she's written about this on the Gaggle, but where she's performed and with whom, and the pieces that she played, there's just really just amazing stories. And so, and we're always amazingly fortunate to have her provide insights into the playing of the Western classical musical repertoire, and so I always learn so much from her. And now I recently posted Bruckner's Fifth Symphony, so I'm really looking forward to. I hope Anne Marie will have the time to say something about Bruckner, because I wrote a little bit about it, but as I always say, I write about it as an outsider. I have no real idea of what it's like to play music as difficult and as challenging as that of Bruckner. So, um, this is where I get to learn from Anne Marie. But anyway, Anne Marie, thank you so much for your generosity and all of your contributions. And I think my time is up. Somebody says BBC reporters do have weak voices. Yes, they do. But he didn't. This report, she was a she. She sounded like she had a kind of weak artificial voice. That's what you often get. When you go to a website and there's like a supposedly a kind of a vague report, and it's obviously AI generated because it doesn't really sound like an accent from any particular country. It doesn't sound like a human voice really. It's just a weak um, accentless, nationless voice. So that was my view. My view. But as I say, if anyone has more evidence of this Cézanne, pointing to Zelensky possessing this priceless Cézanne painting, please post it. I would love to see it. So I'm keeping an open mind, but so far I'm not persuaded by the evidence. That one BBC report, just it didn't look like a BBC report. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for today. Thank you for all of your questions and comments. Above all, thank you so much for those who contributed to the tip jar. The dogs are going to be waking up soon. They're going to address the tip jar situation, and the way they address it is immediately to take it out on me as having failed in my responsibilities. As they always ask, what would you say you do here? That's it. But that's my problem. Over the weekend, we're going to do some more podcasts, and then next Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, Peter and I will do our joint live stream, and then we'll be back next Tuesday for my solo live stream, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, all the best. Have a great weekend. See you soon. Bye-bye.